Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief.
And I'm Matthew Chekai, managing editor at MEI. On May 23rd, Washington reversed 4 decades of U.S. policy, taking a major step toward fulfilling President Donald Trump's earlier pledge to drop sanctions on Syria. According to the State Department's official announcement, the U.S. will be waiving Caesar Act sanctions for 180 days, and it has issued a general license authorizing transactions involving the interim Syrian government. What will these initial moves by Washington mean in practice? How will they affect Syria's post-war recovery and reconstruction efforts? Where are U.S.-Syrian relations headed? And how are other regional and international countries reacting to this shift in U.S. policy? To answer these questions and more, we've invited one of D.C.'s leading experts on Syria, our colleague, MEI Senior Fellow Charles Lister. In addition to Syria, Charles's work focuses on terrorism and insurgency across the Levant. He is the author of several books, including The Syrian Jihad, Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and the Evolution of an Insurgency. We are pleased to have him back on today.
Well, listeners can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. And please do check out MEI's other podcasts as well, Rethinking Democracy, hosted by Gindel Toll, and Taking the Edge Off the Middle East, hosted by Brian Katulis, which now have their own dedicated feeds. But now let's get to our conversation with Charles. Charles, welcome back to the program. It's great to have you on.
Great to be back. Thanks for having me.
Obviously, a lot to talk about today, but I thought it would make the most sense to start with the dramatic meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Syrian President Ahmad al-Shara. In mid-May, President Trump traveled to the Middle East on his first major foreign trip of his second term in office. There he met with President Shara in Riyadh briefly. Mm-hmm. How significant was that face-to-face meeting, and what were your main takeaways from it?
I mean, it was hugely significant. For now, it is the game changer. Of course, anything can happen down the line, but certainly for now, it has changed the game completely on Syria. I think most of the regional states, and certainly Syrians within the transitional government, were, as far as they were concerned, an in-person meeting was the best way that U.S. policy was going to, take a turn for the positive, particularly when it comes to sanctions. Very well known that the Trump administration itself was more or less dead set against what was announced by the president in Saudi Arabia. And so, yes, the strategy for a while now has been, we need to get directly to President Trump. We need to convince him of the case here that this is the chance for Syria and the region to move forward. And that is exactly what happened. We had a phone call between Donald Trump and Turkish President Erdogan about a week before his trip to the region, where this argument was made very sort of forcefully. And then the follow-up by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in person in Riyadh. And then we had the announcement literally hours later at a gala dinner. So that's what happened. But for Syria, everything changes now with the announcement on sanctions, with full-scale in-person U.S. engagement. We now have a U.S. Special Envoy, Thomas Barak, a longtime friend of President Trump and who happens to be the ambassador in Turkey. So things have moved very quickly since that announcement.
There's been a lot of criticism inside the U.S., especially from political opponents of the Trump administration, about the president's decision to meet with Shara as well as declare an end to the sanctions on Syria. But in your view, why should the U.S. reach out to Shara's interim government despite its previous links to Al-Qaeda and ISIS? And what was at stake if Syria were left internationally isolated and the U.S. sanctions had remained in place?
Yeah, it's a good question. There has been some criticism, although I have to say it's been much more muted than I would have expected. Certainly, loyalists around Donald Trump have rallied around the cause, and even individuals who I know for a fact were vehemently against this have spoken publicly saying it was a good idea and that we're moving forward. So, his circles have certainly rallied around. And the core of the Democratic Party's foreign policy establishment have actually praised this move. So as far as meaningful and influential decision makers and policymakers and lawmakers are concerned, there does appear to be support for this. And there's one key reason for that, which is with our eyes wide open, knowing the challenges associated with Syria and with the transitional government and its leadership and their histories, the removal of the Assad regime for the first time in over 50 years does genuinely present a strategic opportunity for the Middle East writ large to turn a corner. And no question that for the vast majority of the Assad family's rule of Syria for many, many decades, Syria was like an open wound in the heart of the Middle East that did very little other than export instability and threats and dangers. So there is at least an opportunity to see Syria represent something different now. And that's the kind of strategic gamble, the strategic calculation that was very early on made by the outgoing Biden administration, certainly fairly quickly by Europe, very quickly by the region, and now by the Trump administration. And I think, the defining dynamic was always going to be if and when the US government got fully behind that strategic calculation. And we do at least appear to be there now.
What would you say about some of the specific pushback and criticism on this, specifically that the rollback of sanctions should have been leveraged in a way or tied to affecting behavior of the Shara government to be more inclusive?
There was always a bit of a tussle within the US government more widely around this issue of sequencing and whether or not these were conditions that needed to be met for sanctions relief or expectations that would be met amidst sanctions relief. For me, and also having spent time in Syria since Assad's fall, there is absolutely no understating how bad the economy is and how desperate the humanitarian situation is in the country. Given the 14 years of debilitating conflict and everything that comes from that, including deep, deep, deep grievances within and across different ethnic and sectarian groups and throughout Syria, plus the economic and humanitarian crises, my argument all along was we didn't have the time to wait for long, significant conditions to be met before giving the economy some oxygen to breathe again. In that sense, it doesn't matter what the transitional government looked like. It doesn't matter if we had literally designed the most perfect Democrat figure with global international recognition and put him as the president. The transition would still have failed if we hadn't given Syria's economy some space to recover. So I think what we have seen is a recognition of that there are plenty of problems still in Syria. There are problems within the transitional government itself. But if we have any chance of seeing those problems resolved, and if we have any chance of the transition widening in terms of representation of Syria's rich cultural and ethnic and religious diversity, then we have to allow the economy to recover. And the argument to President Trump in Saudi was, we in the region are primed to invest, primed to engage and support strategic level reconstruction, rehabilitation of the energy infrastructure, agriculture, really get the economy up and running. So it's not that billions of US dollars need to be spent on anything. It's just that the US had to get legislation out of the way to allow others to do that. So it's really a debate over sequencing. And I think the evidence overwhelmingly points to the judgment that giving the economy breathing space first, whilst keeping expectations on the table rather than conditions, is the smarter and more strategic approach.
As you referred to earlier, there have been some significant differences within the Trump administration when it comes to Syria policy in the past, not to mention a variety of views in Congress. Everyone seems to have gotten with the program now that the president has shifted. Do you think we'll see those differences start to resurface going forward?
Well, there is a real sensitivity around. I mean, listen, the Washington, D.C. media space was very well aware how almost hostile most of the administration was to the idea of any level of engagement with this new Syrian government. So what we saw within 24 hours of President Trump's announcement was a sudden real sensitivity to any of this being made public, any of this becoming a big news story, because it's a potentially very combustible administration itself. You come out as an opponent or a critic of a major international decision by the president, you can find yourself without a job very quickly. So we have seen all of those figures, notwithstanding all of their personal views, rally around the corner. Now, there is a possibility that if the transitional government in Syria made a hiccup or makes a mistake, or we see a resumption of sectarian violence in one corner of the country, that some of those voices might start making some noise again. I would suggest it's much more likely they'll start leaking things rather than speaking publicly for obvious reasons. But yes, that's certainly still possible. It's also a question of time. How long does Syria's transition now have without any hiccups? The longer the duration of that time, the less likely that critics within the administration will be able to voice those criticisms. So this is really now a really big test. And it does, looking at the data, come at a time when Violence inside Syria is steadily declining. Over the last 4 to 6 weeks, we've seen a steady decline in violence. We have seen that some of the really deep-seated sectarian tensions involving Alawites on the coast, Druze in the south, and other communities, not fully resolved, but mediated and de-escalated to a significant degree. And we've seen the government establish much more of a presence in those sensitive areas with the acceptance of the local communities. So at least we've seen steps forward. So in that sense, I would be quite encouraged, but huge steps, still lie. There's Israeli-Syrian de-escalation talks still ongoing behind the scenes, and those are encouraging, but they could also break down. There's the very sensitive issue of SDF talks with Damascus and their potential integration, which again are going in an encouraging way, but could also break down, and they are very fragile. ISIS is very significantly resurging now over the past 6 weeks or so, and have pointed their agenda towards the transitional government, labeling them a couple of weeks ago as an apostate government. So there's lots of other reasons for concern. But so far, the steps being taken by the transitional government itself have been the right ones, which I think is also why we've seen President Trump make that decision.
You touched on it briefly earlier, but I wanted to ask about the Friday appointment of Tom Barak as the new U.S. Syria envoy. What do we know about his priorities thus far? And what does this tell us about Washington's policy towards Syria? Is it potentially subordinating its Syria policy to its Turkey policy? How do you read that announcement?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, he's a longtime friend of President Trump. Much like we've seen Steve Witkoff assume major responsibilities on a whole number of files that, technically speaking, he might not otherwise have been qualified for, he's seen as a very trusted confidant of the president and given great responsibility for that. And I think Tom Barak's appointment as ambassador to Turkey, in and of itself, putting Syria aside for a second, represented very much the same strategic calculation. President Trump has made his positive views of Turkish President Erdogan very clear repeatedly, very clear that he's determined to heal the relationship between US and Turkey. And again, having a close friend and trusted confidant in Ankara to do that is exactly part of that strategic calculation. Likewise on Syria. I think President Trump is somebody who likes being seen as, changing the game fundamentally on big issues. And clearly this made big headlines. And if it works, it really will be a historic achievement. And so again, having that very sensitive process under the control of a close friend and confidant is how President Trump operates. The fact that he's sat in Ankara tells us a lot, I think, about how President Trump sees the future of US Syria policy going through and with Turkey hand in hand, which, we can spell out all of the potential consequences of that. It adds further to the existential challenge that the SDF has faced since Assad's fall, puts them in a very tricky position.
The
And
SDF being
the Syrian Democratic Forces, our 10-year partners in the fight against ISIS. It puts them in a very tricky spot, but it also, there's been a regional conversation around forming a regional security alliance that will replace the US if and whenever it leaves Syria militarily. And so that puts Turkey in a more advantageous position to be the kind of de facto leader of that regional coalition, which had already sort of begun to develop their leadership position within that. So yeah, it puts Turkey in the driver's seat in terms of determining what happens next. And that's a big change from what we've been used to for US Syria policy over the years.
I want to turn next to the Syrian economy and the kind of process and challenges associated with unwinding U.S. sanctions. Before we get into the details of that, can you briefly sketch for our listeners, give them a sense of what the current economic situation in Syria is like?
It's hard to know where to start. I mean, the Syrian pound has lost 99% of its value in the past 10 years. Most of that loss of value happened since 2020. When I was in Damascus, over a 5-day period in February, the price of bread fluctuated by as much as 40% on day by day, 40% more expensive one day, and then the next day, 40% less expensive. That's crippling for the average Syrian. If you are a mid-level public sector, civil servant anywhere in Syria, your salary is about $30 a month. But the cost of living for an average family of 5 is about $350 a month. So it is as bad as you can get. 90% of Syrians live under the poverty line. 70% of Syrians are entirely dependent on humanitarian aid. And yet, the United Nations, which runs the Syria aid response, their budget for 2025 is only 9% funded. And that budget is to meet the minimum needs in Syria, not to make things better. And so, yeah, you spell out the consequences of that, and the humanitarian crisis is as bad as it's ever been in 14 years of Syria's crisis. So, yeah, no matter where you look, the situation is dire. In a sort of awful bout of irony, you add to that the reality that Syrians in the immediate region are flocking back to Syria. And they're likely to come back in bigger numbers now that sanctions are being eased. And now that we're in the school summer holidays, the school term kind of schedule was the key thing hanging back returns until now. Many Syrians with children will be looking to return for the new school year, which begins in the fall. So when you add hundreds and hundreds of thousands of returning Syrians onto an already dire economic and humanitarian situation, it is terrible. And then just very briefly on economics specifically, US sanctions were an iron fist around Syria's economic neck. No bank anywhere in the world was willing to process a financial transaction into Syria, even if there were pre-existing US or European waivers that would have technically allowed those transactions to happen. Syria was just this red alarm bell that immediately flagged anywhere in Syria. And again, to give you an example, when I was there, I wanted to switch one of my departing flights. I logged onto the Turkish Airlines website and I couldn't pay for anything on my phone or on a computer. It's just impossible while you're in Syria to process any kind of electronic payment. So you can only imagine again how crippling that is for the ordinary Syrian citizen.
As Matt mentioned at the top, on Friday, the Trump administration announced that it issued a general license authorizing transactions involving the government and a 180-day waiver on the Syria Act sanctions. How significant are those moves, and what does the unwinding process look like going forward from here? What are we looking at in terms of the kind of steps and timeline involved?
Well, this is where it gets super, super complicated. And I'm not like a kind of congressional law expert. With the Caesar Act, it is inextricably complicated. And I've asked a number of people who really are very good at this kind of stuff. And even they find it difficult to fully explain the process. The key here is the ability of the US government to issue waivers that basically mean, even I think Secretary Rubio's wording was, the US government executive waiver effectively removes US sanctions. So for now, that's the easy go-to solution whilst the much more complicated legal process plays out. And we shouldn't forget that many sanctions on Syria, including big ones that have designated it as a long-standing supporter of international terrorism under the Assad regime going back to 1979, have been there so long that the longer they've been around, the harder it is legally to remove as well. You've got decades of additional legislation added on and tacked onto the original laws. So it's really complicated. But the key thing here is the messaging from the US government. And conversations I've had with major banks and major potential investors and businessmen and elsewhere say, with a substantial waiver in place and language from the US government that makes it clear that policy has shifted. In other words, this isn't a 90-day test. It's not a 180-day test, but the US now is fully engaging with this government. We are turning the page. We're working with the region. That will give banks the added incentive to process transactions. And there appears to definitely have been a shift in that kind of psychological mindset already. In the last week since Donald Trump's announcement, we've had major financial investment deals, memorandums of understanding, some of them for hundreds of millions of dollars, agreed with the Syrian transitional government from China, from the UAE, from Europe, from regional states. Those weren't happening until a week ago. So clearly that mindset has shifted. We've had major investment delegations from Qatar, from Kuwait, from Bahrain, all in Damascus in the last several days. So now we're in this kind of wave of charging in, trying to get ahead of the game and secure major business deals. So something's shifted.
Earlier, you sketched out a little bit the security situation on the ground in Syria. If I were to summarize you, I would say you effectively painted a picture that would be guardedly optimistic. Would that be?
As guardedly optimistic as you can be, yes.
And it struck me that your description seemed to clash a little bit with the way that Secretary of State Marco Rubio characterized the situation in Syria during his testimony before the Foreign Relations Committee, where he said that Syria was weeks away from potential collapse, a full-scale civil war of epic proportions, and that the only way to forestall such an outcome was to drop sanctions and engage with the current Syrian government. So at the very least, he was connecting the security situation to the sanctions issue. Was that hyperbole a little bit on his part, or has the situation been changing more dramatically in recent weeks, especially since the Shara meeting? How would you
Yeah.
describe this?
I mean, I think the civil war on epic proportions was slight hyperbole, but I actually fundamentally agreed with Secretary Rubio's logic. What he was really saying was, if it wasn't for the US easing or lifting sanctions on Syria, this is where Syria was headed. And that I have been in agreement with since Bashar fell on December the 8th, 2024, was that, and it's probably been the thing I've shouted about the most, which is, if we don't give the Syrian economy some breathing space, Syria is only going to decline and collapse into conflict all over again. And so I'm completely in agreement with Secretary Rubio. But yes, I mean, it was never going to be the case that removing Bashar al-Assad would just bring automatic peace to Syria. There are all of the grievances and the history from 14 years of civil conflict, but there are also decades-old, deep-seated sectarian grievances in Syria that way predate the 2011 conflict. And I heard about those when I was there. I mean, Syrians were sometimes remarkably open about where they stood, particularly with Alawites. To be frank, I heard an Ismaili from central Syria say to me, pull me aside at the end of a meeting and say, one day the Alawites are going to get what's coming to them. It wasn't coming from a jihadist. It wasn't coming from someone from the Sunni majority. This was an Ismaili from a minority community. There are deeply seated grievances within Syria as a result of 50 years of Assad family rule, in which minorities were weaponized against each other. Societies were turned against each other in order to coup-proof the regime and keep the regime in power. And that has consequences. And honestly, we don't have the time to get into all of these in detail, but a lot of the conflict that we've seen break out on the Alawite coast along the Mediterranean, and the hostilities we've seen in the Druze governor of Sweden in the south, have been much more complicated than the way that the media has presented them. There have been a plethora of different actors and different agendas at play in that violence, all of which feed into exactly what I have just described. There is a lot more history here than just lawlessness or chaos or revenge for things that have happened over the past 12, 13 years. And that's going to take Syria a long time to get over. So whenever I speak to policymakers on Syria, one of the first things I say to them is, temper your expectations. Syria is not going to be this kind of, placid, peaceful land in 3 months' time because we've been chosen to engage or because sanctions have been lifted. We might get there in 10 years, but it's going to be messy for a while. The ability of the government to disarm, demobilize, and reintegrate armed groups is going to take a long time. It's going to be messy. There are going to be, errors made along the way, etc., etc., etc. The main message here is temper our expectations. But yes, there's plenty of cause for concern down the line in terms of conflict. ISIS being one, sectarian tensions being the other, the SDF track with Damascus being another on top of that. And then there's organized crime. The Captagon trade appears to be still bubbling along, although on a lower level. There have been seizures in Saudi Arabia in the last week, which was worrying, seizure in Turkey. So there's lots of different repercussions certainly from the past 14 years of conflict that still are going to pose really serious challenges to the government.
Could you speak a bit more to the situation involving the Islamic State detainees and their families who are being held in camps in northeast Syria? What has been happening on this front, especially over the past month or so?
Yeah, so this is a big topic of conversation between the Trump administration and the new Syrian government. For background, there are 2 IDP camps in northeastern Syria under the control of our partners, the SDF. Al-Roj, which has about 2,500 former residents of ISIS's territory, and Al-Hol, which has about 39,000. The vast majority of those 40,000 or so people are women and children. About 60% of them are children. And then on top of that, there are at least 20 prisons containing a total of 9,500 ISIS male fighters. So this, what we've called at MEI, the detainee crisis, has been a long-standing, huge, basically unprecedented legal, logistical, humanitarian security challenge for the US, for the SDF, and for the international community. Obviously, given the fact that the expectation now is that the SDF will one day integrate itself into the rest of Syria and subjugate itself to the transitional government authority, there is an expectation that these camps and prisons will eventually be handed over to government control. And the question here is really timing and sequencing, and we're hearing different things from different people. President Trump discussed it with President Ahmed al-Shara in Saudi Arabia, and he said, per his press secretary, very explicitly, we want you to take over these prisons and these camps. The State Department's position is ultimately that will have to happen. The Department of Defense on the ground is already facilitating conversations around how that will happen. But when you speak to the SDF, their position is we'll always control these facilities. And they're saying that for a reason. It's their biggest source of leverage and influence over the international community. And they don't, even though they've spent many years saying we don't want to have to be doing this, they now realize that this is their one big tool in the tool basket that they don't want to have to let go of. Over this past weekend, for the first time, a delegation from the Syrian transitional government went to Al-Hol and Al-Roj, and I was told to the main prison, Guayran prison in Hasakeh City, to inspect the facilities, but more importantly, to engage in a new kind of dialogue process with the SDF around exactly this question I'm discussing. Are the prison facilities and the camps going to be turned over to the government? And if so, when? And how do we get there? The first confidence building measure has now been agreed, which is that the government in Damascus will now work hand in hand with the SDF to facilitate the return of Syrians in those camps to their places of origin elsewhere in Syria. Whilst Assad was still in place, the 10,000 plus Syrians in these camps could not return to Assad regime-held areas. Now they can, and they want to. And there has to be coordination between these two actors, the SDF and Damascus, to do so. That's now been agreed following that meeting over the weekend. So that will be a good confidence-building measure. And if and when it happens, that's going to cut the population of those camps by a third, which will be the biggest achievement we've ever seen in terms of resolving this detainee crisis. So really positive movements forward, but still the crux of the matter will come if and when the SDF is convinced to hand over control of those facilities to the government in Damascus. That appears to be the international demand, but the SDF is clearly resisting the idea of doing that. And their public rhetoric is making that very, very clear that they do not want to do that.
And just to close out this set of interconnected security issues, what does all this mean for the U.S. military situation or the U.S. military presence on the ground?
Yeah, so prior to events in the last few weeks, the U.S. had roughly 2,000 troops in Syria. President Trump directed the Department of Defense to at least half that number. And so we have seen over the past several weeks, the US troop level go down to 1,000 or less. We've basically seen the US withdraw entirely from Deir ez-Zor governorate, the main governorate in eastern Syria along the Iraqi border. And so our big bases there, Al-Omar, Green Village, and Conoco, have basically been vacated almost entirely. Al-Omar base is still being used for talks between the SDF and Damascus with US soldiers mediating, but they're really not military bases anymore. And what we're basically seeing is, if we had a map in front of us, the US troop presence is withdrawing to the northeast corner of Syria, which is the heartland of the Kurdish component that leads the SDF. That will kind of be basically the final phase of the US military deployment in Syria. No one knows yet how long that final phase will last, and I suspect it will entirely depend on the fate of talks between the SDF and Damascus, how those talks go, when they get completed. And the big question, of course, is what happens to ISIS? Where is ISIS by the time that happens? And how does the security of those camps look? And then finally, of course, what is the shape of this new regional security alliance, which brings together Turkey, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, and Syria, that will basically take over responsibility for countering terrorism in Syria if and once the US leaves. So there's still big unopened questions, but a path now is very much paved towards an eventual US withdrawal, which is not a place where we were, 12 months ago.
Charles, there are a variety of outside actors with interests in Syria, from regional neighbors like Israel to the European Union, Russia, and China further afield. How are they reacting to the recent change in U.S. policy, and what responses have kind of stood out to you have been most noteworthy so far?
I mean, when Assad fell, the vast majority of governments around the world that had a stake in what was happening in Syria embraced the idea that this was a strategic opportunity that needed to be embraced despite the risks and challenges and dilemmas associated with the transition. And that was something that the Biden administration aligned with, the outgoing administration. There has really only been like one and a half exceptions to that rule. The 1.0 exception was Israel, which instantly within hours of Assad's fall embraced a more hostile, guarded posture and has launched hundreds and hundreds of airstrikes, artillery strikes, ground incursions, occupation of territory in southwestern Syria since. And the half would be Iran, which appears to have covertly taken steps to try to support an anti-government insurgency in the Alawite coast. We can maybe come to talk about that in more detail, but they appear to have done that at the very least. And they appear to still be encouraging weapons smuggling to Hezbollah in Lebanon through Syrian territory. And there have been seizures coming from Iraq and seizures coming from Syria towards Lebanon almost weekly now for the last 6 months. Except for that, everybody else has embraced the idea that this is an opportunity. And of course, there's lots of diversity within how that opportunity looks like. Different European states have had different priorities. The French have been very forward-leaning. The UK have been very forward-leaning. The Germans have been quieter, but behind the scenes trying to use their influence within the European Union and Brussels to push sanctions relief and what have you. Southern European states have been very, very forward-leaning on the ground, led by Italy. And of course, they, under the tail end of the Assad administration, the Assad regime, were seeking normalization with Assad for one reason, which wasn't that Assad was great or not. It was that they wanted refugees to return and they wanted refugees to stop flowing towards Europe. So everyone has different priorities. But yeah, big picture is the vast majority of countries with a stake have prioritized the idea of engagement with an eye to stabilizing and widening the transition.
Where does the U.S. policy shift leave Israel then? Do you think it's a little bit more constrained in its actions going forward, given the U.S. policy shift?
Yeah, I think Israel had an open playing field for 5 to 6 months in Syria, which is where we saw, all those numbers I listed: over 700 airstrikes in 6 months, nearly 200 ground incursions, occupation of 200 additional square kilometers of Syrian territory. But now that playing field has, as you, I think, implied, become more challenged or more constrained. And there are a number of things at play there. Turkey has tried to exert itself more assertively to try to deter Israel's freedom of aggression or freedom of action in Syria. And as a result of that, and there was one night 6 weeks ago or so where we looked like we were almost on the brink of a fighter jet on fighter jet clash between Turkey and Israel over this issue. There has since been mediated talks between Israel and Turkey. They've established a deconfliction hotline, and they seem to be keeping out of each other's space now, which is encouraging. But we've also seen, amidst increasingly aggressive Israeli action against the Syrian government itself, including strikes in the gardens of the presidential palace one night, the initiation of secret talks between the Syrian government and Israel. So to an extent, the real escalatory ladder we were on until probably mid-May has been stepped down, but it hasn't stopped. For the last week, Israel conducted around 15 ground incursions, the average of at least 2 a day, which is no insignificant rate of ground incursions into Syria. That's almost as intense as they've been since Assad fell. But their air and artillery strikes have completely stopped. And so I think we're in this strange place where the Syrian government are sort of willing to allow these ground incursions to continue. They've never tried to challenge them, but I mean, they're not complaining about them publicly. But there is clearly a determination now to try to come to a more mutually acceptable place where there is much less distrust on both sides. Israel's public rhetoric has completely changed. What was fascinating was that 3 days before Trump went to Saudi, the Israeli foreign minister made some public remarks on Syria where he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but these are almost the exact words. He said, ultimately, we do want to have good relations with Syria's new government. And whilst we do have security concerns, we don't believe that any of those can't be addressed. That was a complete about turn, which came out of nowhere. There was no clear reason for this sudden change of rhetoric. But then, of course, 3 days later, Trump was in Saudi Arabia and he announced sanctions relief. I don't think the Trump administration tipped off the Israelis about this. I think they probably picked up through intelligence channels that something was coming, because they have since said they think that the US shouldn't have lifted sanctions. They should have kept conditions on the table. So they're clearly not content, but they have shifted their rhetoric and they have de-escalated some of their military actions, which is at least a good sign. It's not resolved. Damascus wants to return to the 1974 disengagement accord as the kind of mutually acceptable place to be. But that would require Israel vacating 220 square kilometers of territory that they occupied within days of Assad's fall, which, frankly speaking, as an analyst, I don't see them doing. So we still have a fairly substantive area of disagreement, but there's real energy being plowed regionally into trying to deconflict and de-escalate between these two.
The other side of that equation that you were talking about earlier with Turkey, obviously, is Turkey. Just curious, like, how is your read on how Ankara is perceiving these current steps? Turkey obviously keen to get the Syrian refugee population to return home, also keen to probably take advantage of some of the economic opportunities around reconstruction, especially the construction sector.
Yeah.
What's your read on how they're seeing this?
Well, I think not helped by rhetoric from President Trump himself, I think the Turks feel like they've won a great victory here, and this is their victory alone. Of course, most of the region, with the exception of Qatar and Turkey, had basically normalized with Assad when he fell. And so to an extent, there's some justified reason for Turkey's kind of triumphalism. But then at the same time, the government in Damascus is clearly determined to balance its regional relations. It definitely doesn't want to look like a sort of Turkish puppet by any means, given regional and geopolitical sensitivities. And I think they've towed that balance quite successfully. But the Turks are increasingly assertive at trying to assert themselves. Senior military delegations in and out of Damascus over the last week discussing taking over military bases, deploying aircraft and air defense systems, all of which are triggering serious Israeli complaints. Very close intelligence channels with MIT, the Turkish intelligence service, and Syria's new general intelligence director and their interior ministry. So the Turks are clearly determined to insert themselves into the security sector. And then, as you say, more broadly on the economic side, Turkey sees, Turkey's economy is not in a great place itself. And so the prospect of being able to invest and reap returns from major construction contracts in Syria is a huge attraction. And there's definitely been significant interest in that. The Turkish energy minister has been in and out of Syria and in and out of Damascus repeatedly over the last several weeks. And he has plans to export huge amounts of electricity directly to Aleppo and then further into Syria's electricity grid, establish a new gas pipeline into northwestern Syria, which would then create or generate electricity inside Syria. So even in the energy space, the Turks are seemingly determined to insert themselves. But they have competition, but they have a real advantage in that many of the people they're dealing with have long-standing relations because of their prior place in Idlib. And they're seeking to use those relationships, and until now, quite effectively. But to be blunt, it's the Gulfies and others who have the real hard cash behind them, who might be second in the door, but they have much more of probably of a strategic advantage in trying to curry those bigger contracts going down the line.
Well, there are a number of outside actors with equities in Syria, as we've touched on. Shara's interim government has not been a bystander to events by any means, but has actively been involved in international outreach to shape the country's future. What is Damascus doing to reach out to these various key international actors, and how successful has it been in that process?
Mm-hmm. I mean, they're doing what they can to reach out, but honestly, I think what they're doing is receiving more than anything else. And what struck me tracking the number of countries, I think we're now at 63 countries around the world who have deployed or sent senior diplomatic leaders and delegations to Damascus in 6 months. I don't think we could probably find anywhere in the world, in any situation, let alone a post-conflict situation, where such a rate of international diplomacy has flocked to a capital city. So it's based probably unprecedented in intensity. And so, frankly, most of their energy is dealing with just receiving delegations constantly from China through Central Asia to Europe to the United States to South America. All of the multilateral bodies, they're flocking to Syria. So they haven't had to do a lot, frankly, to convince anyone that Syria might be an opportunity. Seemingly everybody else has made that judgment. Their challenge, frankly, I think, now that US and European sanctions are being actively lifted, is how they will balance the geopolitics associated with now very real deals. And there will, sadly, inevitably be geopolitics involved. We've gone from having small scale Chinese companies going to Damascus 2 months ago to discuss ports and railways, to now official government delegations from the Chinese Foreign Ministry discussing huge hundreds of millions of dollars contracts in wet and dry ports and all kinds of other things. We've seen the French now coming in with their major shipping giants, CMA, CGM, who've already sealed a number of major deals. And now we're seeing rhetoric from the Syrian government suggesting that the United States should have first choice in terms of investing in Syria's energy sector. There was some leaked reporting in CNBC Arabia over the weekend about allegedly what is already being discussed with several American businessmen very close to Trump about establishing a Syria US or Syria US energy conglomerate that's going to reconstruct oil and gas plants and have a place on the US stock exchange and all kinds of things. So really like wild stuff being discussed, but it speaks to the idea that in their, I don't want to call it rudimentary understanding of international diplomacy, but they're growing their experience. I think they are very well aware that if they want to keep the Trump administration on side, they need to try to be seen to be giving them favors. But at the same time, they are going to still need the Gulf states. They are probably going to still need the Chinese, and they certainly want European credibility and investment too. So figuring out how to balance that surge of interest and investment proposals is, I think, probably going to be one of their biggest challenges. They're not going to want to create any kind of firestorm or rivalries between different countries seeking to invest. And that's going to be a real challenge for them.
As we're running low on time, I wanted to draw you out a little bit more on this question of the geopolitics here. As you've written before, the fall of the Assad regime has created a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to transform Syria and its role in the world. How might Syria's geostrategic role change if the region and international communities support the country's reconstruction and reintegration into the global order?
Well, I guess this is a good place where we can end on a super optimistic note, which is I started quite early off saying how Syria for so long had been this open wound in the heart of the Middle East, which represented very little other than instability and threats. And I do genuinely think that in a kind of perfect optimistic scenario, Syria could be exactly the opposite. It is geographically situated in the heart of the Middle East, and it can be a hub in all kinds of different ways. And that we've already heard discussions of that. The Iraqis are interested in expanding their oil pipelines through Syria to the Mediterranean. The Cypriots and the Greeks are interested in expanding telecommunications, submarine cables through Syria and into the Middle East. The Qataris, the Egyptians are interested in gas pipelines that will then run through Syria into Turkey and into Europe. So technically speaking, Syria has an enormous opportunity to become a hub, a transit point for trade, for oil, for gas, for telecommunications. So it's not necessarily that Syria is going to become some huge monopoly exporter on anything. They have some oil and gas. They have a small but struggling agricultural sector. Their future is in being a transit hub for trade in all kinds of significant materials. And that's very much where their economics ministry, their finance ministry, the central bank, where the energy ministry and the telecommunications and information technology ministry are all pointed. They've all got these interesting sounding big proposals. Silk Link, which is going to be this big telecommunications infrastructure that links Syria to all of its regional neighbors and then into Europe, as one example. And they have put in some of those ministerial posts some pretty entrepreneurial people. Abdussalam Haykal, who's their telecommunications and information technology minister, is a fascinating guy, super dynamic, and he's coming up with all these incredible ideas. and seemingly ideas that are being latched onto by international players. So again, it's an open playing field whilst US and European sanctions are out of the way. And as long as the Syrian transitional government continues to stabilize, broaden in representation, and all of those security challenges are kept at bay, the optimistic take here is that Syria has every opportunity to become something that it wasn't. And then tying in other struggling parts of the region into being in a better place. The Jordanian economy has long struggled, but if it gets to be interconnected with a much more prosperous Syrian hub, it will benefit from that. Lebanon, I think we all know, is in a desperately bad place. It's frankly remarkable that in some ways Syria has leapt ahead of Lebanon in the last 6 months, and Lebanon's been left behind, still struggling internally, economically and politically. But Lebanon would benefit too. And then again, from a Trump administration perspective, if Syria manages to be tied into some kind of more peaceful place with Israel, then the region really does start to look like a much more stable and prosperous place. So that's the optimistic selling point here. That's the opportunity that we have. No question that the challenges along the road are enormous, absolutely enormous, very complicated. But it doesn't mean that those opportunities can't necessarily be grasped. But we do have to temper our expectations with how long and how complicated a process it will take to get there.
That's all the time we have for this week. Charles, thank you very much for joining us again on the program.
Great. Thanks for having me.
And thank you to our listeners for tuning in, and to our production team for all of their work on this week's episode. You can find MEI's latest coverage of Syria, the wider Levant, and U.S. regional policy on our website at www.mei.edu. And you can follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Tim.
And I'm Matthew Chekai. We hope you'll listen in again next week.